Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we welcome author and historian Surekha Davies to discuss her brand new book. It's fantastic with an awesome cover, Humans, A Monstrous History. That is not something glaring on the screen. That is how awesome this cover is. So how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. I'm really excited to get stuck into your book and discussing it with you because I thought it was really interesting. But I think the first question I want to ask you, and I know it's a bit of a cliche question to ask a historian, is what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I watched far too much Star Trek as a child, so I had this kind of deep need to be kind of encountering extraterrestrials in some shape or form. Started off as a physics major at university. Realized by the end of the first year that actually there wasn't going to be any warp drive in my lifetime. That's what studying quantum mechanics will do for you. So I became a historian of science and studied the history of exploration. And as I was working on my first book, which was about 16th century map makers and how they began to understand what the human means in different ways as new peoples were found in the Americas, I was in Washington, D.C. at the Library of Congress, finishing this manuscript when, we, the fellows at the library, realized there was an astrobiology conference going on downstairs. And we were invited to go along. And astrobiology is the study of the possibility of life on other planets, in other galaxies, and, how we might kind of look for that life and what it might mean for humans to find them. So this conference was called Preparing for Discovery, preparing for finding microbial or intelligent life elsewhere, or that life kind of ending up on Earth. And in one of the panels about hostile aliens and dangerous pathogens, all the scientists were talking about, weapons. This was the only way they could imagine preparing for dangerous aliens. And I thought, well, they're missing a point here. And I put up my hand and said, okay, now preparing for discovery and preparing for encountering dangerous aliens isn't just about weapons. How about preparing people on Earth for the shock of realizing there are extraterrestrials on Earth? What if what if people's kind of religions that don't leave open the possibility of life in other galaxies are kind of traumatized? What if there's looting and panic at an alien landing? And clearly, how might we learn to work together better so that if extraterrestrial life forms or germs are incredibly dangerous, we can work together to find solutions or survive an apocalyptic scenario. And there were people in the audience nodding, but the chair of the session cut me off and said, that's the wrong question, because I wasn't talking about weapons. I was talking about preparing society to work better with different cultures. But that's when I realized, actually, I'm onto something. And even, hard sciences and current, public policy, these are places that someone who studies the 16th century has something to offer and to a kind of like big questions. And, I was finishing off one book about monsters in the Renaissance. And I kind of began to think about how what I learned from that was actually something that should play a part in how we think about science and society even today.
I think it's really nice, and that's come out of a kind of interdisciplinary space. I think we don't do that often enough as historians. I really quite like that it's come out of that. But then when we're when we're going to talk about monsters and the monstrous history of humans, I think we need a little bit of context and definition around what a monster is, because I think, and you point out in the book, so many of us are going to have different understandings of what makes a monster. So could you help us with that point?
Sure. Well, I guess today people often think about monsters as just something at the spooky corners of the bookcase. But what I show in the book is that every system of classification that has discrete beings also has explicitly or not category breakers, things that lie across categories. So imagine for a moment that uh, a Star Trek cyborg, a werewolf, and Frankenstein's monster go to a bar. No one's going to scream fire, but they might scream monsters, because what those three beings have in common is that they break categories. Werewolf breaks the separate categories of human and animal. Frankenstein's monster is, both dead and alive. And the Star Trek cyborg is kind of made up of organic, living beings and also machine parts. So a monster, in the most general term, is simply a category breaker. They don't have to be horrible. They can be neutral. They can be positive, like the Muppets. And so the book is about categories and how people define the edges between them, between human and animal, between human and God, and the effect on society of those systems of classification. And so, I guess I talk about monsters at three kinds of boundaries. And one is between human and other stuff, so machines, Martians, gods, animals, but also the so-called monsters that police the boundaries between social groups that have different rights and statuses in the body politic. So, these are the categories of gender, race, nation. And the third kind of boundary at which you have very specific kinds of monstering going on is the parameters of normal for a human body. And so words like freak, giant, genius, or prodigy say something about what's normal for a human body to be able to do. And so, the kind of monsters in the most broad and kind of general sense are, any being, real or imaginary, or any category of being who troubles, two or more categories by being, existing across them or not existing in any categories of the people who are observing them.
And I found it really interesting how you broke it down into those different areas, because it made me think about our history in different ways. But then, as we're going through those three categories, they do often crop up in different eras, different locations, and different civilizations. But what struck me with that is that it's happening across all of those places, across all of those times. So where do we kind of see these ideas of monsters emerging?
Well, they seem to be there at the kind of dawn of like recorded texts, which is kind of amazing. And kind of one of the earliest kind of texts kind of surviving today is a story with monsters in it. And that's the Gilgamesh epic from the kind of ancient Near East. And it was written in Sumeria, which is the kind of language of kind of ancient Mesopotamia, now in Iraq. And this is some 4,000 years old. And there are also lots of monsters in ancient Greek and Roman texts. So again, we're going back 2,000-3,000 years. And there are stories in kind of scientific texts, like Pliny the Elder's Natural History, a couple of thousand years old, and he writes about animals, peoples, minerals, stones, natural phenomena all over the world, and talks about monstrous peoples who live in places where the climate is harsh. And then there's the kind of medical and kind of biology practitioner Aristotle, who wrote about how any creature that doesn't resemble its parents is a monstrous birth, an aberration. And especially if they don't resemble the father. So women were kind of default monstrous because they'd failed to be born as men. There were also uh, stories about how an individual monstrous birth, say, a two-headed calf or a baby with too many limbs, might be a sign from the gods, so a divine portent. And then you had to figure out what this sign might mean, and such a birth might also be a punishment. So in the kind of ancient Near East, there are these stories of monstrous individuals, monstrous signs sent from the gods, and monstrous species who live in places where the climate is harsh. And those stories carry through the Middle Ages and into the 16th and 17th centuries as well.
And there's so many different interesting threads I want to pull upon in your answer there, but something that really struck out for me is that focusing on sex and gender, where women are default monstrous and they are seen as the cause of that at times. Why is a lot of this history centering around treatment of women, or focusing on women's role within this?
One of the surprising things for me was realizing that women were monstrous in multiple ways. One, because they, in the Aristotelian, universe, had failed to be born as men, so nature had failed to make them male. But also they were seen as what I call kind of monster incubators, because no one knew how life formed and was born, and no one knew why some individuals might be born with very, very atypical physical features. A child with two heads, for example, many of these babies might not survive very long through infancy. And so we have this mysterious process of generation whereby like beings are born. And one of the explanations that physicians and religious figures gave for monstrous births was that kind of women's imagination was capable of subverting nature. So if a woman had a fright, say she it's an example from the 17th century of someone who went to Leadenhall Market in London and was frightened by a lobster and then gave birth to a lobster child. There's a manuscript in the British Library where this woman's son-in-law talks about this situation. Then if a woman was thinking of someone other than her husband, she would give birth to a child who looked like this other person. Or if she saw an alarming picture in a book or a painting of a monkey, there was this risk. And I think this monstrous imagination was, these ideas emerged in a setting in which paternity mattered a lot for legal reasons. In an aristocratic family, you would pass down a title through the paternal line. Property would be passed down this way, and yet nobody could really control a woman's body. And in the era of the Atlantic slave trade, the offspring of a woman, there are new laws written about what the status of a child will be if a woman who is enslaved gives birth to a child. And even if the father was a white enslaver, laws were written whereby the child would take on the status of the womb of the mother. So there you are with, if a child had a white enslaver for a father and a black enslaved African for a mother, well, okay, so what's the child going to be, black or white, or mixed heritage, as people might say today? Laws were written to kind of not have laws written to disappear those kind of mixed race individuals by saying that the child would always be black. So there were kind of legal repercussions to how you categorized a baby.
And I think it's really quite interesting how they're creating those categories to kind of explain away things they can't explain, but then the involvement of race within it as well. And there seems to be that, obviously, with monsters, there seems to be that fear around what is something, what is someone. So throughout that history, and you discuss it in your book, that there's a lot of fear surrounding race, pre slavery and post slavery as well. Why is a lot of that coming into this idea of what it is a makes a monster, and why is so much of it coming from a Western European, white Western European perspective?
There are a couple of different drivers, shall we say, of monster making around race. One comes from the fact that in the kind of 16th century Europe, bodies were thought to be malleable, so you weren't fixed with a certain kind of temperament and set of personalities, but rather the climate, what you ate, even how you behaved would shape your mind and body. What this meant was if you travel to distant places, your mind and body might theoretically change. And so once European travelers are going everywhere and colonists are settling in places with very different climates, that did beg the question, where's the boundary between human space and monster space? So there was a new set of anxieties created by Europeans going on ships and settling in new places like the Caribbean. What would your offspring be like? And one of the ways people dealt with that anxiety was to decide that, well, actually, wherever you originally came from, there will be some characteristic of that is preserved. And one of the narratives that was written to justify slavery was a kind of Black Africans were much better suited, supposedly, to labor in the climate of the Caribbean. And so for wealthy planters, one of the fears was that, all of their enslaved workers would rebel, and there were far more of them than there were of kind of enslavers. And there were also poor white indentured servants in the Caribbean. So all of these kind of poor workers had a kind of common had common needs. This was backbreaking work, and they were not treated terribly well. But during the 17th century, kind of various island colonies like Barbados, the lawyers wrote new legal codes that officially defined Black enslaved Africans as a different kind of being from white Christian servants. So there were these slave and servant acts that gave different rights to Black and white people, that decreed that you'd be given a reward if you captured an enslaved African who had escaped a plantation. And by writing these laws and effectively defining enslaved Africans as no longer having any kind of personhood, they would be property for their entire lives. Their children would be property. By defining them this way, they've been pushed out of the category of the human, and kind of worker solidarity has been broken. So there was an economic driver for monstrifying people, so that you could say that they didn't deserve the human rights that others deserved. But there was also this kind of existential reason to insist that bodies carried with them some essence of where they began, so that the Creoles, the European descended people in the Americas, could continue to have a power and status that was different from indigenous people and enslaved Africans. And also to kind of, it's in a curious sort of magical thinking that you write a story that says you won't become monstrified in a harsh climate. But this is kind of indeed the sort of double think that went on.
And I think that double think is really interesting. But you mentioned about the malleable idea of mind and body there, and something that stuck out for me is not just those economic forces which create those malleable ideas, but also the idea of religion. And there's a point in your book which really stuck out for me, is people turning from Muslim to to Christian, and their whole shape, color, face changing with that transition. Why has religion been such a strong force in this monstrification of categories and people?
That, goes back to at least the Middle Ages. And in, say, kind of medieval England, in medieval Iberia, and indeed across the kind of European kingdoms, you begin to see in the Middle Ages laws that insist that people who are Jewish live in particular places. They wear badges so that you can tell that they're Jewish, and they have kind of different rights. In medieval Iberia, for centuries, this was a region of kind of Muslim kingdoms, kind of central and southern Iberia, and gradually the Christian monarchs from Castile and Aragon, took over kind of southern half of the Iberian Peninsula of Spain in what they called the Reconquista, and so for anyone who was kind of genuinely Christian, not pretending, but actually Christian, they wanted to go to heaven. I mean, this is like a real situation in their lives and deaths, and they wanted their family to go to heaven as well, and they didn't want anyone accidentally practicing like wrong things and then like failing to go. So for individual people, there was that very practical, personal anxiety over religion. For in the political sphere, the rhetoric of religion was kind of one of those things that went hand in hand with making your state more powerful, and building the kind of like modern and administrative state with power over people's lives and laws. But the problem with religion and belief is that you couldn't really look on somebody's body and know for sure what they believed. And so these kind of attempts to corral people in different areas and demand they wore different clothes and badges was actually an attempt to make religion visible on the body. And in medieval Iberia, there arose this concept called the purity of blood, limpieza de sangre. So after the Inquisition and Catholic monarchs insisted that to stay in Spain you had to convert from Islam, you had to convert from Judaism to Christianity. They then decided that, well, how do we know anybody these people have really converted? Again, you can't observe on the body their actual faith in their hearts. So the only way they could deal with this notionally monstrous category, the descendants of people who converted, the conversos, the only way to kind of deal with the fact that you couldn't be sure that they'd converted was to decide that they were going to be suspect for like throughout their genealogy. So if you were descended from anyone who converted, for a time, you weren't allowed to go to the Americas because there was a fear that those people and their secret practices would interfere with attempts to convert people in the Americas. And so the parameters of normal behavior in the body politic has, over many, many centuries in Europe been tied to faith. And we see this also with the Reformation, with the rise of Anglicanism in England. And, it's ironic to think the whole thing began because Henry VIII just wanted a divorce. And he went and like founded a new religion to bring that about. So often the rhetoric of religion has been used for someone to get some other thing they want. And so when we see, monster making around religion and stereotypes of people of different faiths, some of those elements come from people fearing that they won't get to heaven, or missionaries genuinely wanting people who will not go to heaven, together with people with very different agendas of power.
And I was just about to touch. I find that intersection with power incredibly fascinating, and the fact that that's happening throughout medieval Europe through that power of religion is so interesting. But then on the flip side, how is this process occurring in other civilizations in Asia, in South America, in the Middle East? Because it's not just a distinctly European sort of monstrification.
There are, in, numerous cultures, there are, beings that are, in kind of one way or another, we might use the word, monster, to describe them insofar as they cross categories. For example, in indigenous, American cosmologies, it was, kind of fairly normal to think about different beings and species kind of having a life force that could move around, or that you could actually know what another kind of being was like through the kind of really kind of study. So the hunters would study the sort of animals they hunted and really almost be able to kind of mind read them. And this was something that kind of European settlers and missionaries saw as a kind of shape-shifting cosmology. So the idea that the soul could move across beings was sort of one of the elements of the kind of flexibility across nature. And then notions of kind of reincarnation in Asia again separate the body from the soul, and have a soul that would potentially move to from a human to another kind of animal, depending on whether or not they've led a decent enough life. And so if you think of the human as being a nice and tidy single individual, reincarnation kind of explodes that. So in a way, I'd say often there are monsters, in the sense that there are, beings that are not tidy. And yet, there's anxiety over that and denial. In other cases, and this is where, our bodies, for example, have microbes in them that affect our personality, our behavior. There's the microbiome. Our skin is porous. So in that sense, we're monstrous because we're not one. We're this fuzzy, human-shaped suits in which all kinds of like microbes, pull our strings. So in that case, I'd say like we're actually monsters in the sense that we're not one. But we may kind of move through the world hoping and wishing that we were one and don't have to worry about pollution, for example. And of course, in other cases, monstrification is a storytelling tactic to create separation where in fact there's continuum. So whether it's reincarnation or a kind of cosmology in which the kind of gods have given birth to humans or other species or monsters, or political settings in which different kinds of people and social groups get different kinds of laws. How people write about a continuum, whether they're comfortable with it or whether they decide individual groups are monsters, are in the sense of exceptions and everybody's actually tidy and separate. Those things shape people's lives and institutions and historical events.
And it seems to me in your answer there that there's a clashing of positivity towards monstrification and a negativity. Why do we kind of see it as a negative process? And are there positive examples?
I think there are definitely positive examples, and I have a bunch in the book. I mean, for example, great talent is something that is a sign of someone who is capable of doing far more than the average person. Olympians are at the limit of human prowess in their sports. And we celebrate what they're able to do and feel inspired by them. And yet they are monstrous in a non-judgmental sense of being at the edge of the parameters of the human, because no one can do that as well as they can. And sometimes they have unusual physical characteristics that help them, like swimmers who can hold their breath more, or the exact shape of their ankles and allow them to paddle better. I'm sure like paddle is probably not the technical term. And so it's possible to kind of look at people who are atypical and be inspired to grow and be the best we can be. And fiction has a lot of hopeful monsters, if you will, from the movie Monsters Incorporated, where we look at the world through a city full of quote unquote monsters that look like children's horror monsters. And then there's the Muppet Show as well, in which each individual is utterly individual and peculiar. Maybe sometimes they seem part human and part animal. What is Gonzo? And they, so, we're very good at imagining, ways of living in which we are inspired by individuals and groups who are not typical and conventional. But I think, life is full of challenges and worries. And for thousands of years, stories have been told about, vulnerable individuals and groups, whether they were widows in the 16th century who were accused of being witches. It was a way in which people who were maybe grieving the loss of a newborn child, tried to kind of figure out why on earth this terrible thing had happened to them. And more recently, in the modern world, in times of great economic hardship, there's a danger that those legitimate worries will be used by bad faith actors to bring about their increase their own power by saying, what, the reason you're poor is these other even poorer people are taking your money.
I think that positive spin, I think it was really nice approach to showing that the term monster is it can not just be these negative terms, but then how that monstrification process is also still being used by people to fulfill a gender, much as it was in the medieval period, much as it was in the ancient period. But then a lot of these kind of monsters that we're touching on throughout this conversation are seem to be living, physical living monsters. How is that kind of evolving today? Because it doesn't seem it's so much as that big hairy thing with spines under your bed. It seems to be a very different kind of almost threat.
I guess the non-living dimension of monsters is the machine, and what we mean by human is also affected by how we think about technology and machines. And I would say that there are kind of modern technologies that are monstrifying all of us. So the human is kind of inconvenient for a corporation, insofar as paying a human being is like one of those costs, which in a very, very narrow definition of capitalism, like a company tries to make as much money as possible while lowering their costs as much as possible. I mean, this is the agenda of a corporation. I mean, you might say so. So there's a non-living being whose interests are diametrically opposed, to those of its workers in a very kind of that in the kind of worst kind of capitalism. And what AI has meant is that more and more of the kinds of things that are quintessentially human, making art, writing books, acting, writing poetry, making music. All of these things have become activities that, large learning model based generative AI can mimic by sweeping up copyright content, sweeping up content that humans have made, and getting algorithms to spit out something that looks like one of those. And so it seems to me that the kind of human is no longer, the default being in modern society. The kind of human is an inconvenience to, corporations. And so, we could say that, corporations are monsters, um, neural nets are monsters, but in fact, those systems are monstrifying the majority of people because, workers are a cost to a corporation. But, we need to, when people are kind of promoting the use of technology and saying it's terribly beneficial, it's important to ask beneficial for whom.
No, I
And
totally agree on that point. Saying why is it beneficial and who is it beneficial? I think we both, as historians and writers, distinctly feel the threat that poses and how we could possibly be monstrified in that process.
indeed, exactly. Um, there are, and it isn't just our people as employees who are being monstrified, but what does it mean to not do some of the things that develop us as people? I mean, writing is scary, or like writing a letter is scary. Writing fan mail to an Olympian is maybe not scary, but there's there's kind of personal stakes for it. But I remember in the summer, I think it was Mark Zuckerberg who was helping their child to write fan mail to an Olympian, and then used AI to help their child write to an Olympian. And I think that kind of action and AI boosterism that encourages us to use AI to write letters to people, or to read an AI summary of a TV series instead of watching the TV series. Well, we actually want to spend our consciousness writing fan mail. We might want to spend our consciousness in interacting with our family members. We might actually want to watch TV shows. So what it means to be alive is being reframed simply for the purposes of the kind of AI companies who want us to be using their things, destroying the environment, because these things are very heavy on water and energy, and beneficial for whom. And I think the way in which big tech is even funded, with venture capital, unimaginable amounts of money gets thrown at something that people don't need. And just imagine that same kind of money being invested in schools, or in just kind of infrastructure. So what it means to be in society, how a human being might want to spend their work time or leisure time, we've been cut out of all of that. And the only metrics that count, in a way, the only thing that counts as human is a corporation's balance sheet.
And I think it's really nice to have seen, or or perhaps terrifying to have seen, what it means to be human evolving across eons, across civilizations, across continents as well, but also how that process of monstrification has changed alongside that. And I think that's a really nice point now to ask you our final fun questions we do for all guests who come on the podcast. Quite clearly, when I was reading through his book, I saw that you have watched and read an awful lot of work that discusses or shows the idea of monsters. We've already mentioned Star Trek. Here we've mentioned Monsters Inc. But what was your favourite that you watched or read across this process?
My favorite so-called monster has got to be the little girl in Monsters Inc. So, why am I, so I'm claiming here that she's a monster. Like, what do I mean? So in Monsters Inc., the normal beings are, the hairy, furry, giant beings that live in Monstropolis. And the city of Monstropolis is run on the power of children's screams. So monsters, go through closet doors every night, frighten children, and then the screams get bottled and brought back. And at the same time, the monsters in Monstropolis fear children. They think they are dangerous, they're toxic, maybe they even have laser vision. So the worst thing they can imagine is that a child would accidentally get back through a closet door and end up in Monstropolis. And this is what happened. And this 2-year-old girl, accidentally comes back and all hell breaks loose. And I love the way the movie is a monster movie with all the standard tropes of like people running and screaming. And they're running and screaming from a 2-year-old in a pink dress, no shoes, and only one sock. And frankly, she's incredibly inspiring to me because she's fearless. She comes through this door and sees this gigantic blue furry spotted being with big teeth, one of the monsters. And she looks at him and calls him Kitty. So she isn't monsterifying even the monster. She sees a fun furry being. And, she's incredibly tough. Of all the monsters who go out on the scare floor, as it were, she's assigned the most horrible one because she's that tough. But she realizes that she too is capable of fighting, her monster, and by the end, in order to defend, someone she cares about, she learns how to fight the monster. I love her character, and I started to like buy and wear pink things after watching this film. It came out a couple of years before I started my PhD, and really was quite inspiring.
I absolutely love that answer. That was one of my favorite movies growing up. So I think that's one of the best answers we've had on the podcast. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you. I'm glad to be entertaining.
Now, people obviously listen to us speak about such small aspects of your book. So where can people grab a copy of Humans: A Monstrous History?
You can buy it anywhere books are sold, online or from a bookshop. There's a discount code, a 30% discount code, if you order it from the University of California Press directly. You can go to their website and click on UC Press for buy, and there's a code UCP Save 30. If all of that is too confusing to remember, my own website, surekhadavies.org, has a page about the book and some buying options.
Fantastic. And then where can people interact with you if they want to learn more about your work? You mentioned your website and you have a Blue Sky.
Yes, Blue Sky is my default water cooler. So do please come and follow me and post quotes from the book or other stuff as you like. I also have Instagram and Threads accounts, and I'm on Mastodon. And you can find all of those, bits and pieces via surekhadavies.org, or just search for my name in Blue Sky. I'm at Dr. Surekha Davies.
Fantastic. Well, make sure all of those and a link for your book are in the description below so people can go away and learn more and interact with you as well. But thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way.